You won't believe what happened to my daughter. Just when we thought our quiet suburban life was safe, an innocent refusal turned into a nightmare. It all started with a simple decision to not attend the HOA meeting, a choice my daughter made after months of growing tired of their overbearing rules. But Karen, the HOA president, wasn't going to let that slide. I'll never forget the moment she stormed into our home, her face red with fury. She pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at my daughter, demanding compliance. I froze. My heart raced. But what happened next will leave you speechless. Turns out, Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was the county sheriff, using her badge to bully the entire community. This twisted power dynamic was about to come crashing down, but not in a way anyone expected. Keep watching. This is just the beginning. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into today's crazy story, I've got a question for you. Where are you watching from? I want to know the city you're in. Drop it in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button because you don't want to miss more jaw-dropping stories like this one. Now, I've got a tale for you that's going to shock you to the core. I'm talking about something that happened to my daughter, something that changed our entire view of the neighborhood we thought we knew. We just moved into this peaceful suburban community where everything seemed perfect, the kind of place you picture when you dream of raising a family. But little did we know, there was something dark brewing beneath the surface. It all started with the HOA. For those of you who may not know, HOA stands for Homeowners Association, basically a group of people who manage the rules for your neighborhood. But this HOA wasn't your typical community organization. No, they were a little too controlling, a little too power-hungry. My daughter, fed up with their endless restrictions, made the choice to skip the next HOA meeting. It seemed harmless enough, but little did we know, this simple refusal would set off a chain of events that no one could have seen coming. Karen, the HOA president, came to our house that day, and the confrontation quickly escalated into something much more dangerous. She pulled out a gun, pointed it at my daughter, and threatened her over something so trivial. What happened next will blow your mind, because it turns out Karen wasn't just an HOA president. She was the county sheriff, and everything was about to change. Trust me, you won't believe the twists this story takes. Keep watching. It's easy to think of a suburban neighborhood as a quiet haven, a place where kids ride their bikes on tree-lined streets and neighbors wave as they walk their dogs. That's exactly what we thought when we moved in. My family and I had just relocated to a small, tight-knit community, and we were excited about starting fresh. We'd left behind the chaos of city life and were eager to embrace the tranquility that came with suburban living. Little did we know, the peace we sought was just an illusion, one that would soon be shattered by a woman we would come to know all too well. Karen, the HOA president. Our new home was everything we dreamed of, a cozy house on a cul-de-sac surrounded by well-manicured lawns and friendly faces. We quickly settled in, getting to know the neighbors, admiring the old oak tree in the front yard, and spending evenings in the backyard grilling burgers and playing catch. The first few weeks felt like a dream. Then came the Homeowners Association, HOA. At first, the HOA seemed like just another mundane part of suburban life, a group of people responsible for enforcing the rules and maintaining the aesthetics of a neighborhood. The letters they sent out were nothing out of the ordinary, reminding us to keep our lawns tidy, paint the fences every so often, and ensure that we didn't let our property values dip. In the beginning, it seemed harmless, but it didn't take long for us to realize that the HOA wasn't just a community service, it was a force to be reckoned with. And Karen? She was the one wielding that power. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Karen. She was, for all intents and purposes, the type of person who thrived on control. You know the kind. The one who has an opinion on everything, feels the need to be in charge, and expects everyone to follow her rules without question. At first, she seemed like a typical HOA president, nothing special. She dropped by occasionally to remind us about neighborhood meetings or the upcoming yard work deadlines. But there was something about her, something unsettling, that made me feel uneasy. It wasn't long before Karen's personality began to show through. She wasn't content with just ensuring everyone followed the HOA guidelines. No, she seemed to take pleasure in enforcing them. Small infractions became big issues. Missing a single meeting meant getting a sternly worded letter in the mail as if you'd committed a crime. Forget to mow your lawn on the weekend? Karen would show up at your door to remind you of your duties as a responsible homeowner. At first, it seemed ridiculous, but it soon became clear that Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules, she was obsessed with them. The more I got to know Karen, the more I started to realize that she wasn't just any regular HOA president. She had a sense of entitlement, a belief that she could dictate how everyone lived. It was as if the HOA was her kingdom, and she was the queen, unquestionable and above reproach. As time passed, Karen's behavior became even more erratic. She would show up unannounced at neighbors' houses, inspecting their yards, their fences, their driveways. She'd make little comments about improvements that were needed or about how the neighborhood needed to uphold its standards. I began to see how much control she had over people. It wasn't just about maintaining property values anymore, it was about asserting dominance. But we weren't the only ones who started feeling the pressure. Other families in the neighborhood had also begun to notice Karen's overbearing presence. Neighbors who'd lived here for years, who'd never had an issue before, were suddenly being called out for the smallest violations. One neighbor got a warning for not trimming a bush properly. Another had been fined for parking in front of their own house, even though they'd been doing it for years. Karen was everywhere, watching, judging, and making sure everyone knew that she was the one in charge. This kind of behavior might seem harmless in small doses, but over time, it started to have an effect on the entire community. People became fearful of speaking out or questioning her. They worried about getting fined, getting warnings, or worse, having their standing in the neighborhood questioned. Karen had created an atmosphere of tension, a place where no one felt safe to just live freely. My daughter, who had always been outspoken, began to get frustrated with the HOA's overreach. She hated the constant surveillance and the rules that felt more like restrictions than helpful guidelines. At school, she'd talk about how unfair it was that Karen would come to people's houses without warning, telling them what to do, what to fix, and when to fix it. My daughter wasn't the kind of person to back down when she believed in something, so I wasn't surprised when she told me one day that she was done. She wasn't going to attend the next HOA meeting. She didn't want to be part of a system that made people feel less than. I was proud of her for standing up for what she believed in, even if it meant going against someone as powerful as Karen. I told her to stick to her guns, but little did we know that refusal would set off a chain of events that would spiral out of control. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable. People started talking behind closed doors, sharing their frustrations in private. The whispers of Karen's overreach had begun to surface, but no one dared to speak out publicly. Karen had cultivated such a fear-based environment that residents felt powerless, and if you dared to challenge her, you risked facing her wrath. It wasn't until the night before the HOA meeting that things really began to escalate. My daughter, adamant in her decision, was ready to stand firm. She wasn't going to be intimidated by Karen, not after everything she had seen. We didn't think much of it at first. It was just a meeting. But looking back, I now realize that this was the moment the story shifted, the moment our lives took a dramatic turn. Karen wasn't going to just let my daughter's refusal slide. She wasn't the type to back down or take no for an answer. We had no idea what we were about to face, the storm that was coming. And we certainly didn't know that the woman we had been letting run our community was about to turn from a mere annoyance into something much, much more dangerous. The HOA meeting was set for the next day, and with it came a series of decisions that would change everything we knew about our neighborhood. But the reality of what was coming for us was something no one could have predicted. The darkest twist was yet to unfold. It all began like any other afternoon. The sun was setting behind the tree line, casting a soft orange glow over our quiet neighborhood. I was inside, prepping dinner, when I heard the unmistakable sound of someone knocking at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but when I peered out the window, I saw her, Karen, the HOA president, standing on our front porch with that usual stern expression she always wore. I knew it couldn't be good. For weeks, my daughter and I had been anticipating this confrontation. We had heard the whispers of neighbors talking about how strict Karen had become, how she was enforcing her rules with no room for compromise. My daughter's refusal to attend the HOA meeting was no small matter. It was a direct defiance of Karen's authority, and that was something Karen wouldn't tolerate. I called my daughter downstairs. "Get ready, honey. It looks like Karen's here." My daughter, still in her school uniform, looked at me nervously, but I could tell she wasn't backing down. She had made her decision, and she wasn't about to let anyone intimidate her. Little did we know, Karen wasn't just angry, she was livid. As I opened the door, Karen didn't waste any time with pleasantries. "You've raised a disrespectful child," she said, glaring at my daughter, who was standing behind me in the doorway. "She refuses to follow the rules, and now I'm here to make sure she learns her lesson." I stood there, taken aback by her venomous tone. I had never seen Karen this furious before. Usually, she was all about issuing warnings and making passive-aggressive comments, but this time, she wasn't holding back. The sheer anger radiating from her was palpable, and it sent a chill down my spine. "Karen, calm down," I said, trying to de-escalate the situation. "She's just a kid. She doesn't want to go to the meeting. It's not that big of a deal." Karen's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward. "It is a big deal. She's undermining my authority, and that's something I won't tolerate. There are rules for a reason. I won't let her get away with this." At that moment, my daughter took a deep breath and stepped forward. "I don't want to go to your stupid HOA meeting. I don't like the way you treat people. You make everyone in this neighborhood afraid of you, and I won't be part of it anymore." Karen's face flushed a bright red, and I knew the situation was about to escalate. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could stop her, Karen reached inside her purse. My heart dropped as I realized what she was doing. She pulled out a gun. In a split second, I was frozen, staring at the cold, metallic barrel pointed directly at my daughter. The world seemed to slow down, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. Could this really be happening? Was Karen really holding a gun at my daughter over a simple disagreement? I wanted to move to protect her, but my legs felt like stone. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The woman who had been overseeing our community's rules, the one who was supposed to be keeping everything orderly and safe, was now threatening my child with a firearm. Karen's voice shook with anger as she spoke. "You think you can just defy me? You think this is all a game? You will respect the HOA, or I'll make sure you learn what happens when you don't follow the rules. No one challenges me." I could feel my blood running cold. My daughter's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else in them too, something that made my heart swell with pride. She wasn't backing down. Even in the face of a gun, she stood her ground. "Put the gun down, Karen," I finally managed to say, my voice shaky. "This is insane. You're crossing a line. This isn't about the HOA anymore. This is about you threatening a child." For a second, Karen hesitated. It was as if she realized what she was doing, but the fury in her eyes didn't subside. She wasn't scared of the consequences. She wasn't scared of anything. She had power. She was used to people bowing down to her, doing what she said without question. But in that moment, I realized something. Karen had underestimated us. My daughter and I weren't just going to let her bully us into submission. "Please, Karen," I said, my voice more pleading now, "put the gun down. This isn't who you are. You don't need to do this." But Karen wasn't listening. Her hands were trembling, and the gun wavered slightly in the air. I could see that she was losing control, that she was acting on pure rage, not logic. This wasn't just about the HOA anymore. It was about her own ego, her own need to feel powerful and in control. That's when I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, the engine shutting off, followed by footsteps approaching. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't know who it was, but I was praying it wasn't too late. Then the doorbell rang. Karen didn't react immediately. She was too focused on the situation in front of her, her eyes locked on my daughter. But I did. I glanced toward the door and quickly saw who had arrived. It wasn't just a neighbor coming to check on the noise. It was a woman in uniform walking straight toward us with an air of authority that immediately made my breath catch in my throat. The woman's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. Karen dropped the weapon. I turned, my heart racing as I saw a county sheriff's badge glinting in the sunlight. My mind was spinning. What was going on? Karen froze, her face going pale as she slowly turned to face the woman. You can't do this. I'm the HOA president. I'm in charge here. But the sheriff wasn't intimidated. You are under arrest for threatening a minor and possession of a weapon with intent to cause harm. Put the gun down now. The world seemed to come crashing back into focus. My body finally moved, and I quickly pulled my daughter behind me, shielding her from Karen, whose hands were still shaking around the gun. Put it down, Karen, the sheriff repeated, her voice firm and unwavering. Karen's face twisted in a mixture of shock and rage, but she slowly, reluctantly lowered the gun. The tension in the air didn't completely dissipate, but the immediate threat was over. I looked at the sheriff, then back at Karen, still in disbelief. The woman we had feared and loathed, the one who had tormented our neighborhood with her rules, wasn't just any neighbor. She wasn't just an overbearing HOA president. She was the county sheriff, using her badge to impose her own twisted sense of authority. Karen had been using her position to intimidate the entire neighborhood, hiding behind the law to enforce her power. But now it was clear. The truth was finally coming to light. I stood there in disbelief, trying to process what had just happened. The woman who had been terrorizing our neighborhood with her excessive control, the one who had pointed a gun at my daughter, wasn't just a neighbor. She wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was the county sheriff. I couldn't wrap my head around it. How had we not known? How had we been so blind? It made perfect sense now. Karen's power, her influence over everyone, the fear that had gripped the entire neighborhood. She had been using her position as sheriff to get away with everything. As the sheriff walked closer to Karen, who was still standing frozen with shock and a faint look of defeat on her face, she spoke again, her voice sharp and clear. Karen, you're under arrest. You've used your badge and position to intimidate, threaten, and manipulate this entire neighborhood. You have the right to remain silent. I could hardly believe it. My daughter, standing behind me, was still in shock, but I could see a flicker of something else in her eyes now, relief. She was no longer the target of a crazed woman with a gun. She was safe. And the worst part, the part that would stick with me for a long time, was that the person who had held all that power over us, the one who had nearly taken everything from us, was someone we had trusted, someone who had sworn to protect us. Wait. Karen finally spoke, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. You can't do this. I've been serving this community for years. I've done more for this neighborhood than anyone. You have no idea who you're dealing with. The sheriff didn't flinch. You've done enough, Karen. And for the record, you're not serving anyone. You're using your position to control, intimidate, and break the law. This ends now. Karen's hands shook as she was cuffed and led toward the sheriff's car parked at the curb. She was no longer the powerful figure she once was. The tight grip she had held on the community was slipping away, and I could see the panic in her eyes as the reality of her arrest settled in. For the first time in years, she was the one who was vulnerable. I could hear the muffled voices of neighbors starting to gather outside their homes. They had seen the commotion, heard the shouting, the arrival of the sheriff, and now they were coming out to see what was going on. The group of people who had once been terrified of Karen, who had once feared the wrath of the HOA and its president, were now witnesses to her downfall. And I knew, deep down, this moment would change everything for them too. I could feel a mix of emotions swirling inside me, anger, confusion, and strangely, a sense of justice. I had spent so much time being afraid of Karen, of her power over us, of the way she seemed to control every aspect of our lives. But now, standing there as she was taken away, I realized how much control she had really lost. In that moment, she was just another criminal being taken down by the very system she had once used for her own benefit. I turned to look at my daughter, who was still standing behind me. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with shock, but there was something else in her expression, pride. She had stood her ground, refused to be intimidated, and now she was witnessing the consequences of Karen's abuse of power. "She's gone, Mom," my daughter whispered, her voice still shaky. "It's over." I nodded, pulling her into a tight hug. "Yes, sweetheart, it's over." But the reality of what had just happened hadn't fully sunk in for either of us. Karen wasn't just a rogue HOA president. She had used the full weight of her sheriff's badge to manipulate, intimidate, and control an entire community. I was still trying to comprehend how someone like her could get away with this for so long. How many other people had she tormented? How many others had been afraid to stand up to her, to challenge her, for fear of the repercussions? As the sheriff's car pulled away, taking Karen to wherever she would face the consequences of her actions, I felt a wave of exhaustion wash over me. The adrenaline, the fear, the uncertainty, it was all beginning to hit me. It was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something much larger was at play here. The next few days were a blur. News of Karen's arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. People came to my door to thank us, to apologize for not speaking up sooner, to express their shock at what had been happening right under their noses. But as much as I appreciated their support, I couldn't help but feel a sense of betrayal. The people who had lived here for years, the ones who had been silent, had allowed Karen to create a reign of terror. It was as if they had all been living in a state of fear, unwilling to question authority, too afraid of the consequences. But now that the truth had come out, they were eager to point fingers. It wasn't just Karen's arrest that had shaken the community, it was the realization that the system they had trusted, the very people they had put their faith in, had failed them. The sheriff's office, the HOA, the very fabric of the community they thought was solid, had been corrupted by one woman's thirst for power. I sat down with my daughter that evening after everything had settled down, and we talked about what had happened. We talked about how Karen had used her badge to intimidate everyone, how she had manipulated people's fears to get what she wanted. But we also talked about standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. We talked about the power of courage and what it meant to fight back when you know something is wrong. "You did the right thing, sweetheart," I said, wiping a tear from my eye. "You were brave. And because of you, Karen can't hurt anyone else." She smiled faintly. "I didn't think it would end like this. I didn't think it would be this big." "You were part of something bigger than both of us," I said, squeezing her hand. "You've helped expose the truth, and that matters more than anything." But as I looked out the window, watching the quiet suburban streets, I couldn't shake the thought that this wasn't the end. Karen's arrest was only the beginning. There were still so many questions left unanswered. How many other people had been affected by her power? Too afraid to speak out. And more importantly, what would happen next? The community had been through a shock, and while Karen's arrest was a victory, it wasn't the resolution to the bigger problem that had been festering beneath the surface. There were still cracks in the foundation, and someone needed to make sure that the truth didn't get buried again. As much as I wanted to believe that everything would be fine now, that the neighborhood would return to normal, I knew the real fight was just beginning. After Karen's arrest, the neighborhood was buzzing with a mix of relief and shock. People couldn't believe what had happened. For years, Karen had ruled the community with an iron fist, and now, all at once, the terrifying image of her as the HOA president was shattered. But as much as the community wanted to believe that everything would be fine, there were deeper questions that lingered. What had really driven Karen to this point? What had made her so desperate to exert this kind of control over everyone? It wasn't just a matter of enforcing HOA rules or maintaining property values. There had to be something else at play, a deeper motive behind her twisted sense of power. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen's arrest, while a victory, was only the tip of the iceberg. There was still so much we didn't know about her, about what she had been hiding and what kind of damage she had caused to the community. I had to find out more. The first clue came in an unexpected form. A neighbor, Ms. Miller, whom we'd only spoken to a few times, came over one afternoon with a heavy look on her face. She hesitated at first, but then, looking both ways to make sure no one was listening, she finally spoke. "Listen, I don't know how to say this," she said in a low voice, "but I think I might know why Karen did what she did. I've been doing some thinking, and there's a lot more to her than just being a tough HOA president." I leaned in, my curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Ms. Miller's eyes darted around nervously before she continued. "I've lived here for years, and I've seen some things. Over the past few months, I started noticing that Karen seemed different, more obsessed with controlling the neighborhood, more ruthless about enforcing the rules. But what really got me suspicious was when she started talking about property values and neighborhood improvements. She'd always been interested in those things, but suddenly it was all she talked about. And then she started making strange demands. I could feel my pulse quicken. Strange demands? What kind of demands? Ms. Miller looked uncomfortable, but continued. She was trying to get people to sell their properties. It started with little things. She'd pressure people to upgrade their homes, to make their yards more presentable, even though nothing was wrong. Then, she started telling people they should sell if they weren't willing to keep up with the neighborhood standards. I thought it was weird, but I didn't think much of it at first. "Are you saying she was trying to force people to sell?" I asked, the pieces starting to fit together in my mind. Ms. Miller nodded. "Yes, and I'm not the only one who noticed. I think she was manipulating people into selling their homes so she could buy them at a cheap price. But it wasn't just about that. Karen had a plan. She wanted to turn this whole neighborhood into something more exclusive, something profitable." I stared at her, stunned. "Wait, are you telling me that Karen was trying to gentrify the neighborhood? By force?" Ms. Miller's voice dropped to a whisper. "Yes, she was using her position as HOA president to push people out. She'd make them feel like their homes weren't up to snuff, that they weren't living in a good neighborhood anymore. And if they didn't want to play along, she'd bully them, scare them, or use legal loopholes to make them sell. It was all part of her plan to flip the properties and make a fortune off of the land." I was speechless. The truth was sinking in, and with it, a sickening feeling in my stomach. Karen wasn't just a corrupt HOA president. She had been systematically manipulating the neighborhood for her own gain. Her twisted sense of control was just a cover for something much more sinister. "What happened to the people she forced out?" I asked, my voice trembling with disbelief. Ms. Miller looked away, as if she couldn't bear to answer. "Some of them sold. Others disappeared. I'm not sure what happened to them. But I know this. Karen was the one pulling the strings. She knew exactly what she was doing." I could hardly process what I was hearing. For years, Karen had presented herself as a benevolent force in the community. She was the one who organized neighborhood events, the one who enforced the rules, the one who everyone feared but thought was just doing her job. But behind the mask of authority, Karen had been using her power to manipulate and exploit the very people she was supposed to protect. But why hadn't anyone caught on sooner? How had she been able to get away with this for so long? It hit me all at once. Karen's role as sheriff had been the perfect cover. She wasn't just any local HOA president. She had access to resources, information, and legal power that others didn't. With her position as a sheriff's deputy, she could easily track property owners, dig up dirt on residents, and leverage her badge to scare people into submission. And if people didn't follow her plans, she could use the full weight of her authority to make their lives miserable. She had been using the fear of the law to manipulate people into doing what she wanted. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how dangerous Karen had been. She wasn't just a woman in charge of a neighborhood group. She was a predator hiding behind the law, using her badge to exploit vulnerable homeowners. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events in my mind. I thought about the neighbors who had been bullied into selling their homes, the ones who had been pushed out, the ones who had been too afraid to stand up to Karen's tyranny. I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of regret. How many lives had she destroyed? How many families had been driven out of their homes because of her greed? And then there was the most chilling thought of all. What else had she been hiding? The next morning, I decided I couldn't sit idly by anymore. I had to uncover the full extent of Karen's corruption for the community's sake. I began reaching out to more neighbors, talking to people who had been directly impacted by her actions. What I learned next would shock me to my core. Karen had been involved in a web of real estate deals and illegal property acquisitions, all designed to line her pockets and reshape the entire neighborhood to her liking. She wasn't just a rogue HOA president. She was the ringleader of a much larger scheme, one that involved a network of shady real estate agents, contractors, and even some corrupt officials who had been looking the other way for years. The more I realized that Karen had been playing a dangerous game of high-stakes real estate, and she had used her position to manipulate every single person in her path. Her arrest had only scratched the surface. The full scale of her criminal enterprise was far beyond what anyone had imagined. And now, the fight was just beginning. The aftermath of Karen's arrest was both a relief and a nightmare. The once quiet neighborhood had been thrust into chaos. And although Karen's removal from the HOA was celebrated by many, the tension in the air lingered long after the sheriff's car drove away. What should have been a moment of triumph felt oddly hollow. For days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. People were still talking about Karen's arrest, still processing what had happened. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before were now gathering on the street, whispering in small circles, trying to make sense of everything. The stories that began to surface were even worse than I had imagined. As more people came forward, it became clear that the damage Karen had done wasn't limited to just a few bad HOA decisions. It had stretched much further, like a cancer slowly eating away at the community. As I walked through the neighborhood, I could feel the eyes of my neighbors on me. It was clear that our family had become the focal point of the entire community. We were no longer just another family who had recently moved in. We had become the symbol of resistance. While some people were grateful for what we had done, others looked at us with suspicion. There was a certain unease in the air, a sense that things were never going to be the same again. The tension was palpable, and while some people came forward to thank us for standing up to Karen, I couldn't ignore the darker side of the aftermath. There were whispers, quiet accusations from some who felt that we had stirred up trouble, that by challenging Karen, we had disturbed the peace they had long taken for granted. The truth was, they were afraid of what came next. The worst part, the people who had been under Karen's thumb for so long were reluctant to speak out. They had lived in fear of her for years, and now that the truth had come out, they were left questioning everything. What had they been so afraid of? And more importantly, what else had they allowed to happen? I remember one conversation with an older couple, Mr. and Mrs. Davis, who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. They had always been polite and friendly, but kept to themselves. When I knocked on their door to check on them, Mrs. Davis invited me in. She was an older woman with a kind smile, but her eyes betrayed a deep sadness. "We never thought it was that bad," she said, her voice shaky. Karen was always a little overbearing, but we thought it was just part of the job. We didn't want to make waves. Mr. Davis, who had been quiet until then, spoke up. "We saw the signs, but we didn't think she was capable of something like this. She was always so nice to us. The HOA fines were irritating, but we just paid them. It didn't seem like a big deal. But it was," I said, sitting down across from him, "it was a huge deal. Karen wasn't just enforcing rules, she was manipulating and controlling the entire neighborhood. She's been using her position to profit off all of you." Mrs. Davis wiped her eyes, looking at me with a mixture of guilt and regret. "I wish we had said something sooner. I wish we had spoken up. Maybe we could have stopped it before it got this bad." I could feel the weight of her words settle in. They were not the only ones who felt this way. There were others who had been too afraid to speak out, too afraid of the consequences. The power Karen held over them was more than just fear of fines or punishment. It was fear for their homes, their livelihood, and their place in the community. As the days went by, I began to see a pattern emerge in these conversations. People who had once been silent, who had been intimidated into compliance, now found themselves questioning everything. Some of them were angry, furious even, that they had let Karen control them for so long. Others were embarrassed, ashamed that they hadn't seen the signs or acted sooner. It became clear that Karen's manipulation had been a well-orchestrated system of control. She had created a climate of fear, where even the most basic refusal to conform could result in fines, harassment, or worse. But now that her mask had fallen and the truth was out, the cracks in the community were becoming impossible to ignore. The real problem was this: Karen wasn't working alone. As the community began to peel back the layers of Karen's reign, it became evident that there had been other players involved in her scheme, individuals who had been either complicit or unaware of the corruption at play. Some of them were part of the HOA, some were contractors who had benefited from Karen's demands, and others were law enforcement officials who had turned a blind eye to her activities. We learned that Karen had been using her position not only for personal gain, but to help an underground network of real estate investors, those looking to buy up properties at discounted prices. She had been pushing homeowners to sell their homes, either by pressuring them to make expensive renovations or threatening them with fines they couldn't afford. Once the homes were sold, she helped facilitate the transactions, ensuring that she and her associates made a fortune off the properties. It became clear that Karen's arrest was only the first step in dismantling the network she had built. But now it was up to the community to figure out how to heal. The damage had been done, and trust, once broken, was hard to repair. I spent the following weeks meeting with my neighbors, working with a few brave souls who had begun to speak out to ensure that Karen's corrupt system didn't rise again. We set up community meetings to discuss how we could rebuild, how we could restore the sense of safety and trust that had been destroyed by Karen's manipulation. But as we spoke about reform and change, there was still an unspoken fear in the air, a fear that the system, which had been so easily corrupted, could rise again. What would happen if someone else came along, someone just as power-hungry, someone who could take advantage of the gaps that Karen had left behind? Despite all the good that was coming from the community coming together, I couldn't help but feel that the fight wasn't over. The darkness Karen had unleashed was still lingering, and if we didn't take concrete steps to ensure it couldn't happen again, we could easily fall back into the same trap. A few weeks later, after the shock had started to settle and the community meetings began to show results, we received another letter. This time, it was an official statement from the sheriff's office. The letter outlined the full extent of the investigation into Karen's activities, confirming what we had all feared. She wasn't working alone. There were others, some of them still in positions of power, who had been involved in her scheme. But it was clear this wasn't over. The real battle had just begun. We were going to have to fight to reclaim the community, to rebuild what Karen had broken, and to ensure that no one could ever use their power to destroy lives again. And as I looked around at my neighbors, those who had stood with us, those who had finally found their voices, I knew one thing for sure: we weren't going to let this happen again. As the weeks passed, things slowly began to change in the neighborhood. The initial shock of Karen's arrest had given way to cautious optimism. The community was starting to rebuild. People were talking again, sharing their stories, and looking toward the future with a sense of hope. We had come together to expose the truth, and though the damage was immense, there was a quiet sense of pride in the air. But the more I learned about Karen's web of manipulation, the more I realized how much work was left to be done. There was a darkness that had been allowed to fester for far too long, and even though Karen was behind bars, the damage she had caused wasn't going to disappear overnight. The community had been through a lot, but it was clear that the healing process was going to take much longer than anyone expected. One evening, as I sat in my living room with my daughter, we discussed everything that had happened: the arrests, the community meetings, the uncovering of the truth. My daughter had become more involved in the neighborhood than ever before. She was determined to make sure Karen's reign of terror didn't just fade into the past. We talked about what we had learned, what we had uncovered, and how far-reaching Karen's scheme had been. "We can't let it end here, can we?" my daughter asked, her voice a mixture of resolve and frustration. "There's still so much we don't know. I mean, who else was involved in this? What happens if someone else comes along and tries to do the same thing?" Her words hit me like a punch in the stomach. What if it wasn't over? What if Karen's network had more tentacles than we realized? I paused for a moment, my thoughts racing. There was something gnawing at me, a feeling that something was still hidden in the shadows, something that hadn't yet come to light. The pieces didn't all add up. While Karen's arrest had disrupted the immediate power structure, the truth was that her influence was so deeply embedded within the community systems, both legal and financial, that simply removing her wasn't enough. What if Karen wasn't the only one pulling the strings? That thought had been lingering at the back of my mind for days. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much Karen had hidden. She had used her position as sheriff not just to intimidate people, but to shape the very fabric of the community, to manipulate the system for her personal gain. How had she gotten away with it for so long? How many people had helped her? A sudden, chilling realization washed over me. The arrest was just the beginning, and the real danger was still out there. Karen wasn't just a rogue HOA president. She was part of something much bigger, a web of corruption that had embedded itself deeply into the very infrastructure of the neighborhood, if not the entire county. I felt a knot form in my stomach. We had only uncovered the surface. The sheriff's office had taken Karen in, but who else had been complicit in her crimes? Who else had been involved in her scheme, profiting off the exploitation of the community? I had to find out. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. I couldn't rest until I had answers. I reached out to an investigative journalist I had spoken to briefly during the early days of Karen's arrest. His name was David Brooks, a reporter with a reputation for uncovering corruption, especially within local government. I had kept in touch with him sporadically, but this time, I had a feeling that the information we had wasn't enough. We needed someone who could connect the dots and dig into the parts of Karen's network we hadn't yet seen. David agreed to meet me in person later that afternoon. When he arrived, I could tell by the look in his eyes that he already knew what was coming. We weren't just talking about a corrupt HOA president anymore. We were talking about something far more dangerous. I briefed him on everything we had uncovered, the illegal property deals, Karen's manipulation of residents, and the connection to shady real estate investors. As I spoke, David's face became more serious, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to piece together a puzzle. "This isn't just about real estate deals," David said, pausing for a moment. "There's something bigger at play here." Karen was using the HOA as a front for a network that stretched beyond this neighborhood. She wasn't just trying to flip houses, she was part of a broader scheme involving multiple players. And some of them are still in positions of power. His words hit me like a slap. My worst fears were confirmed. Karen wasn't just a rogue operator. She had been part of a system, a criminal network that involved people in positions of power, officials who had looked the other way, real estate moguls, and possibly even local law enforcement who had protected her all along. David leaned forward, his voice steady but urgent. "We need to expose this. But this goes beyond just Karen. We're talking about people who are still in power, people who are still operating with impunity." I felt a mix of emotions, fear, anger, but also determination. This wasn't just a fight for the neighborhood anymore. This was a fight for the truth. A fight to ensure that the corruption Karen had unleashed didn't continue unchecked. If we didn't stop it, there would be more victims, more people manipulated and controlled. David's eyes softened as he continued. "Look, I know this is hard to hear, but the community has already started to heal, and that's good. But you need to take it a step further. You need to keep pushing. This isn't just about getting Karen out of the picture. It's about getting the rest of her network exposed." I nodded slowly, realizing the weight of his words. The battle was far from over. In the weeks that followed, David and I worked together, diving deep into public records, pulling up documents, and following leads that were left behind by Karen's web of corruption. We reached out to former residents who had been forced to sell their homes. We tracked the money involved in the real estate deals, and we uncovered more than we could have ever imagined. What we found was a tangled mess of lies, deception, and greed. The very foundation of the community had been built on a lie. Karen had been the face of a much bigger operation, one that was still active, still thriving in the shadows. And as the investigation gained momentum, something else became clear. The sheriff's office wasn't the only organization that had turned a blind eye. There were higher-ups involved, people who were still in positions of authority, still controlling the flow of power. The final twist hit me hard. The battle we had started against Karen wasn't just about her, or even the HOA. It was about taking on an entire system of corruption that had infected every level of the community. For justice, and this time there was no turning back. So here we are. After everything we've uncovered, the real fight has just begun. But this isn't just about us. It's about everyone in the community, about the people who have been manipulated and taken advantage of for too long. We need your help. If you've seen something, heard something, or know something about what's really going on, speak up. The truth can only come to light if we all work together. And if you're watching this and you're living in a community that's been run by someone like Karen, someone who's trying to control you, manipulate you, and use their power for personal gain, know that you're not alone. We are stronger when we stand together. Comment below with your thoughts. And if you've ever faced anything similar, let us know. Subscribe to stay updated on this ongoing investigation, because the fight for justice isn't over. It's just beginning.